When my older son was in second grade, there was an appeal for chaperones to accompany his class on a field trip to the Big Cat Rescue in Tampa. Lions, tigers have been rescued, great place, what a great place to visit. And so there was a rather undignified scramble for parents to sign up for this field trip, knowing that in second grade you had to chaperone at least one of your children's field trips. Unfortunately, I did not make the cut. But I was consoled by the teacher with the assurance that I would definitely go on the next second grade field trip, which turned out to be to the West Pasco Government Center. 4 hours stuck in a room with a bunch of 8-year-olds listening to county commissioners talk about potholes. Potholes, Big Cat Rescue. Do you sometimes get the assignment, the project, the task that you don't really want? And in those moments, ever since we were children, when we have found it difficult hearing things we don't want to hear, something that we have developed over all these years, a condition takes over called selective hearing. We have learned to hear what we want to hear because we find it difficult being told to do the things we don't want to do. And as we begin this sermon series on Jonah, Jonah was a renowned prophet, a good prophet of God, it tells us, but he found it difficult hearing the words in the opening verses of chapter 1. God says, "Go to the city of Nineveh." Another prophet, a contemporary of Jonah's, Nahum, wrote of Nineveh in chapter 3 that it was known as a murder city. It was full of lies, bursting with loot, addicted to violence, horns blaring, wheels clattering, chariots lurching, much like Homer Sass on a Friday afternoon on the 19th. Horsemen galloping. This is Nineveh, brandishing swords and spears and corpses rotting in the street. And Nineveh was very much the Syria or Iraq of its day. And you can hear Jonah saying to God, "Are you sure you got the spelling right, Lord? Did you not mean Naples, Florida, not Nineveh?" One of my favorite stories about Franklin D. Roosevelt was how he had to endure all those long receiving lines. And he complained that no one really paid attention to what he was saying to them. So one occasion he tried out an experiment as he went along the line and shook hands with each person, and he murmured to them, "I murdered my grandmother this morning." And guests continued to respond in that way, not really listening, and they would say, "Good job, Mr. President." He would shake hands, "I murdered my grandmother, you're doing great, bless you, Mr. President." It wasn't until he reached the end of the line on greeting the ambassador of Bolivia was it apparent that his words were actually heard. Unfazed, the ambassador leant forward and whispered, "I'm sure she had it coming, sir." Good job, Mr. It's not that God doesn't speak. God speaks. It's that we often don't want to hear, or at least we only hear what we want to hear. That's selective hearing. The Bible teaches from the opening verses that God couldn't be clearer. Go to Nineveh. It's emphatic, it's clear, it's sure. Couldn't be clearer. This is what I want from you, folks of Homer Sassa. This is what I want from you, Jonah. But have we subtly recategorized God as a consultant? He advises, he consults, he suggests, but in the end it's up to you whether you want to listen to God or not. If you take the bulletin, there's 4 things to draw from this scripture today in the story of Jonah. You might want to fill them in as we go along. But number 1 there is that God does not suggest. God commands. Number 1, God does not suggest, God commands. And much of the gradual erosion, you could say, of core Christian values in our nation and in our modern world is that we have slowly downgraded God's commands to God's suggestions. The practice of going to church, it's a suggestion. Of keeping the Sabbath, hey, it's a suggestion. The practice of keeping the covenant of marriage, it's just a suggestion. Of refusing to steal, it's just a suggestion. And so have we now got the 10 suggestions? God gave us the 10 commandments on Mount Sinai because God commands, does not suggest. And he commands to Jonah, go to the great city of Nineveh, preach against it. But what does Jonah do? We know the story well. On a Saturday morning, a manager of a large company needs to contact his head of technical services because a computer system had gone down. So he called the employee's home number and was greeted with a child's hushed voice. Hello. Hello, said the manager. Who is this? It's Molly. Hello, Molly. Can I speak to your daddy? No, he's very, very busy. Oh, can I speak to your mummy, Molly? No, she's very, very busy. Molly, are there any other grown-ups there? Yes, the policeman. Molly, can I speak to the policeman? No, they're very, very busy. Molly, why is everyone so busy? What's going on there? They're looking for me. We love it, don't we? We love to hide. And in verse 3 of Jonah chapter 1, it says he ran away from the Lord. And the more you read that, the more you think about that phrase, the funnier it is. Because how can any of us hide from God like the little girl in the story? How can you really run away from God? We do, but is there a moment when we run from God, we go in a different direction, and God goes, oh, that's it then. I won't ever catch him now. He or she has gone. We can't run away from God. God is present. In October around 2003, David Horton decided to go to a Cincinnati Reds ball game. He went with his girlfriend. It was the same week he had foolishly failed to appear in court for a minor drug charge. And during the game, the wanted man decided to give his girlfriend a kiss, a smooch. And it ended up being on their kiss cam. And everybody in the crowd saw it, including David's parole officer, who was also at the ball game. The parole officer and the policeman promptly had Horton arrested. David Horton discovered to his cost that even in a crowd, you cannot hide. And we cannot hide from God. We can't run from God. Last week we read Psalm 139. We cannot go where God is not. Number 2 in our bulletins. We cannot go where God is not. Psalm 139 tells us that no matter where we are, God is with us. He's omnipresent. But those words are not to be read as a stern warning from a divine parole officer, but are to gently and necessarily remind us that in those moments where there is darkness, there is God's light. In our weakest moments, there is God's strength. In our loneliest moments, there is God's presence. We cannot go where God is not. So think of the time and the effort and the anxiety that we would save if we accepted we cannot run from the Lord. But run away, Jonah does, and he does a good job of it. I was wondering the other day, what is the opposite of dusk? And then it dawned on me, so that's good. What is the opposite of Nineveh? This map tells us the opposite of Nineveh was Tarshish. We know that he goes to Tarshish and he gets a boat at Joppa, but I don't know if you realize it, it's completely the opposite direction to where God is telling Jonah to go. Is that an illustration of your life that God says, here's what I want, and often my response is to go in the opposite direction? Tarshish belongs to modern-day Spain. Nineveh was very much the opposite of this place. Nineveh was that city that geographically and culturally was far remote from Tarshish. It was that place of blood, a brutal existence. It was lawless. It was unsafe. Tarshish, on the other hand, was a place where there were a number of military bases. It was a safe area. It was a peaceful city. It had a pleasant climate. It stayed warm all year round, including the winter. A lot of people would retire to that area. It sounds familiar, perhaps. It was the Florida of its day. And so Jonah says, I'll run to Tarshish. And here's the lesson. Tough as it is better to be in Nineveh with God than in Tarshish without God. And right now you might be facing a Nineveh, tough decisions, going through a brutal time of life, testing times. But with it comes two choices. Do I run to Tarshish where God is not, or do I go to Nineveh where God is? Is it flight or fight? And the Bible teaches ultimately there is no choice, for the only place to be is where God is. And God is in Nineveh right now, not Tarshish. Evan Almighty is the story of a modern-day Noah. And Evan Baxter is being told to build an ark in modern times for a flood. And just like Jonah, he has difficulty really dealing with God's request.
So, you're really him, aren't you?
You want more proof? I haven't done the pillar of salt thing in a while.
That's all right. I believe you. I don't understand why you chose me.
You want to change the world, son. So do I.
What? Why an ark? I mean, that's like flood territory. You wouldn't do that again. You wouldn't do that. Would you do that?
Let's just say that whatever I do because I love you.
Well, then you have to understand that this whole building an ark thing is really not part of my plans here. I need to settle into my house. I need to make a good impression at work. What?
Your plans.
What are you talking? We're talking about an ark, right? I mean, an ark? An ark is huge. I don't even know where I would begin.
Al, I hear that a lot. People want to change the world, don't know how to begin. You want to know how to change the world, son? One act of random kindness at a time. Build the ark. I'll tell you what. You build it, I'll fill it. And if anybody asks, tell them flood's coming. Oh, and you might need this.
Okay, so what do? I grab the wood and then... Oh, okay. You know, that's just cruel. Do you see him?
If we're honest, we have quite a bit in common with Evan Baxter and Jonah. And that is more often than not our inclination when God asks something of us is to run, to go in the opposite direction, because more than likely it's going to be something uncomfortable, unsettling, it's going to be challenging, it's going to be stepping into the unknown. If it wasn't, God wouldn't ask us to do it. He would simply leave us where we are. And much of life is spent simply doing what we're doing and being a witness for Christ in that way. But there are times He asks us to go to a Nineveh to deal with something that isn't going to be easy. But number 3, when Nineveh happens, growth follows. When Nineveh happens, growth follows. In those moments when we are tested, we know God most fully. And where is your Nineveh right now? It may be an actual situation, an actual place. It might be a particular need in our church, in the family. And God is saying, go. Go and change it. Did you hear about the ship that was carrying a cargo of yo-yos? It sank 25 times. Where does Jonah's running take him? It doesn't take him to the tropical climate of Tarshish. In fact, it doesn't take him anywhere. It takes him into a storm, and the ship he is on is threatening to sink. Because when there is a running away from God, storms often follow. When we flee from God, when we disobey God, storms often follow. A devoted church member went to a doctor and was really bothered by her husband snoring, and the doctor said, "How much does it bother you?" She said, "It bothers the whole congregation." Author Doris Hare described a long 3-hour journey home from their daughter's wedding late at night. She said, it was late, and my husband was driving, and we talked about how beautiful the wedding had gone. I began to drift off to sleep. Suddenly there was a terrible shimmying and weaving of the car. I thought we were in an accident. I kept my eyes closed out of fear. Again, the same shaking, then nothing more. Opened my eyes, and I saw we were in the ditch in the middle of the divided highway, still speeding along on cruise control. Finally, my husband, always composed, shut off the cruise control, steered the car back onto the interstate. About a mile down the road, I finally asked him, "Did you fall asleep?" "Yes," he said. "Do you want me to drive?" "No," he said with his usual composure. "I'm awake now." What's Jonah doing during this terrible storm? Verses 5 and 6 says, incredibly, this ship is about to sink. A storm is hitting it from all sides. He's asleep. And the ship's captain finds him and yells, "Wake up, sleeper. Wake up." Preacher Carl Eidelman says, here's what this scripture is telling us. Some of us have run from God, and right now there's a storm because of it. People around you see it. Effects are evidence to it, but somehow we don't see it. We are blissfully sleeping through it. And somebody needs to wake us up. Somebody needs to say, cry out to God to save you. Because it's Jonah's storm, but others are affected by it. Number 4, it's my storm, but others are living through it. Others are living through it. And to take that storm away, let's wake up and cry out to God and see what's happening around us. Because the Lord who can calm the troubled waters of life is also the Lord who will sometimes stir them up. Because when we persist in our disobedience, the seas get rough. But the Bible also says this, that God will pursue us even in our stubbornness, even when we rebel. Max Lucado put it so well. If there are 1,000 steps between you and God, you're in Tarshish, he's in Nineveh. God will take 999 of them to reach us. But the last step, that one's up to you. The choice is ours, the last step. So let's stop running and take that all-important step forward. And in a few moments, as we come forward and take communion, perhaps you will use that to symbolically step forward and say, God, I need to come to you. I need to come back to you. I need to take that step because I've been drifting from you. If you're not able to come forward, you can make that prayer and make that step in the pew. Amen.